Hey everybody, today I decided to change the bulb in the VFO of my Yaesu FRG 7700. Thought about it for some time. I was going to replace the bulb with a LED, but I've heard some horror stories about bulbs being too bright, too dull, too this, too that. So I decided to put a similar old school bulb back in, an old regular bulb, similar to what was in there before. So today I'm going at the task of taking apart the radio, the shortwave radio, to replace the bulb. Right now I've got pretty much everything that I need, and I'm getting the screws removed, taking off the casing, the top and bottom casing. I've taken the liberty of speeding up the video here so that it doesn't take so long. You see I have the top cabinet removed now. I'm going to remove the bottom. I've also removed the handle on the side. And of course it's very important at this stage of the game to remove the battery, the memory battery. Once that is removed, I continue on to remove the bottom part, the bottom cabinet, and that will expose the 4 screws that hold the front bezel on. Now I'm taking off the selector there, and the VFO knob. They have inset screws there. The first one I took off just has 1 screw, and the larger one has 2. It's important to mark the first knob so you'll remember where it goes, or when you go to change your frequencies you won't know where you're to. Taking off these small screws now of the inner side, the inner button or dial of the VFO. Pretty cumbersome. These screws are pretty small, and it does take some time and a little effort to get it on the go. Start to remove the buttons, the knobs. Some of them are a little bit difficult. Without scratching the faceplate, you might want to take a little flat top and just work them gently back and forth, especially the inner buttons there. The double stack knobs. The main thing is not to rush. Take your time and don't do any damage. Just take your time and work it back and forth. And I'll show you a little trick when you find some buttons that are difficult to remove. There are different ways of doing it, but I found a way that makes it much easier. This is anti-slip cloth. It's made of rubber, like it's kind of like foam but rubber. Excellent for taking out buttons. There you go. Now we'll proceed to get the bezel off. We need to remove 2 screws on top, 2 screws on the bottom. Be careful of all your screws, keep them in a safe place so they don't get lost. Gently remove the bezel, and there you have it. Put it safely to one side. Oh yes, a mug of tea. I prefer mine black, and I leave the tea bag in. Move that to one side, you wouldn't want to waste that, and we'll proceed. Next we're going to be removing the inner dial that has numbers on it. That is the dial that lights up, and the bulb behind it is what's blown. The small screws that I'm removing now are tapered. They're different than the ones that actually mount the silver button to it. That's the VFO button I'm referring to, the double stack button. And this is a pretty tedious job. It's not difficult, you just want to be careful not to scratch or break this lens. So as you can see, it's going to take a little while to get this dial off. But patience and persistence is the key. And we finally have it removed. Now we'll place this to one side. There's the blown bulb. Now we're going to remove the wiring for the VFO. It's zip tabbed, so we'll cut that and get that out of the way. Gently snip that zip tab off and get the wire free. And then gently unplug the VFO tank. The wiring where it's plugged into the circuit board. Should just come out. Just taking my time here, making sure nothing gets broke. And indeed it is let go. Next we will remove the 4 screws which holds the VFO tank to the front chassis. It's the 4 screws which are closest to the circle. Be very careful now when you're removing this. I've speeded up the video 4 times as fast now, so it's moving pretty swiftly. But just take your time. There's no sense in rushing. Now I'm removing the actual reflector plate. There's a small screw at the back. I'll remove that so I can work at getting the bulb out of that housing. It's pretty well cooked in there. Looks like the bulb is going to work. It's a bit bigger, but it will. First thing we'll do is get rid of this grommet because we're going to use the old one that's still in the reflector. It's going to take a bit of experimenting to figure out how I'm going to get this bulb in. Now we clean it up, and now it fits nice and snug. Now is a good time to get some heat shrink tubing, some pieces to go over the wiring for the bulb. That way when it's all soldered, there'll be no risk of it shorting out on anything or doing any damage to the radio. Now it's time to get the wires twisted together in preparation for the solder job. The solder job is now done. I've put some non-conductive tape on the reflector so it doesn't arc out on the chassis or the circuit board. The clock is now chimed, telling me it's 6 o'clock. Sounds a bit faster because I have this sped up. Typically it doesn't sound that fast at all, believe me. I'm now inserting the 4 screws which holds the VFO tank in place. Once the tank is in place, the VFO tank, I will plug the VFO tank back into the circuit board. Have a slurp of tea and continue on. From here on in, it's reverse of the disassembly. I guess would be the best way to put it. You're looking for the tapered screws now, and you need to line it up so that the screws will go into the proper place inside the VFO mechanism. There's 4 holes there. 2 here holds the tapered screws, and the opposite screws will hold the inside dial. Gently put the bezel back on. Insert the 4 screws which holds the bezel. You'll notice that in putting this bezel on, there's one push button which is restricting the movement of the bezel fully flush, and I will figure that out in a moment and flick it so that it doesn't cause the bezel to stick out. Here we are. Here's the moment, and the bezel fits in perfectly. Tighten the screws, but don't over tighten. These tabs can be easily broken. Now run the battery wire out. It's not quite fitting in snug, it needs to slip in there, so I'm just torquing it down a little bit there. Now it's fitting perfect. And we'll start to put the screws back into the cabinet, holding the bottom and top of the cabinet here. I'm also going to put the battery pack together now, making sure to put the positive on positive, negative on negative, push the wiring inside, and tuck it into place. Top cabinet goes on next, and 4 screws plus the 2 on top. Now is a pretty tedious job. The small screws have to go into this dial here and then insert it into the VFO section over that shaft, line up with the holes that they need to go into, and you can't really see it. But I was very lucky with this first attempt on the first screw. Perfectly done. However, the second one, that was a bit more difficult. In this vertical position, and with the magnetic screwdriver, I can insert it much easier. There you see the magnetic screwdriver. Just hold it, and away you go. Next, we're going to put on the VFO dial. That's held with 2 screws, inset screws, flat top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snug up the dial right now. Not tight, just bring it till it touches the shaft on both the screws. Second one, just bring it to the shaft and then check. If it's in too far, it's going to scrape against the inside dial. At that point, you'll want to unslacken both set screws and just move the button out just slightly and then retighten. Finding this slot was a bit difficult, but there you go. So it's out like a 1/16 of an inch, I guess, and now it's running freely, not making no scraping noises. So now I'll torque down these set screws. Don't over tighten, of course. I don't suppose they'd break very easily, but you just want it snug. And that seems to be working fine. Now this second button, when I took it off, I aligned it up to the number 10, which is 10 megahertz basically. So I need to move the camera up here. There you go. Now I'll put the dial to the 10 mark, as was suggested by my friend Greg and many other suggestions, and tighten the set screw. Checking to make sure that the dial is right on 10 with the marker, and indeed it is. So I will make sure it's nice and snug now without over torquing, and there you go. Now the rest of the buttons need to go on, and some of them need to go on at a perfect position. Your volume button and all the other buttons have certain positions. The volume button you set from 0 to 10 or whatever, according to the segments on the bezel. And the ones that are selector buttons, of course you want to make sure that the white markings on the buttons are in the appropriate position. Taking your time now, it's important. These shafts are made of aluminum, and they can be pried open if a button is loose, but you need to be very, very careful. I've broken off more than one shaft by trying to tighten up a button that was loose. Had to remove this button, so I used the rubber cloth again, set it up and put it back in. Again, the shafts, like I say, you need to be careful. They're made of aluminum, and there's not much flexibility before they'll break. So if you do find a button loose, you can open up the spanners of it slightly. Again, I don't suggest it if you don't think you're comfortable with it. Don't do it, because you're going to end up breaking off one of the tabs that makes the complete circle for the button. The inner ones, the double stacks, need to be lined up also, of course. It's all just taking your time and getting it right. Continuing on here now, taking our time and making sure the buttons are going on properly. You'll notice that there are different buttons on this radio. Some have a white marker on them, and they are the selector buttons. Like your mode selector would be the one that uses the white button, and your memory channel one, and the one for frequency and clock. The others don't have no markings, like the volume button and your squelch. So you'll figure it out. But it's best to have a look at it before you disassemble, and you'll know where these buttons go. Getting ready to do a power up. Unfortunately, there's a lot of light coming in the window. We'll have to move the radio, but it is working. The dimmer button is working, and as you can see, the VFO dial is lit up. Mind you, it's not as bright as an LED, but it now looks like a stock radio, and that's what I was aiming for. I'd like to thank Greg for his pointers and the tips in how to get at the bulb and replace it. I'd also like to thank you people for watching. I hope you did enjoy the video.